My sneaky agenda is to get you to watch them, because if you have even the slightest interest in the Haunted Mansion, and I know you do because you're here, I think you're gonna love these movies.
Welcome to the Creepy Kingdom. We are all about the creepy side of theme parks, films, haunts, and everything in between. We create original films, live streams, vlogs, podcasts, and more. Hit that subscribe button to make sure that you always keep it creepy.
Welcome, foolish mortals, to this video. My name is Audrey, and I'm a little bit obsessed with writing about the Haunted Mansion. There are cliches and ideas that you carry around in your mind that you may not even be consciously aware of that were placed there by classic films. One recent example of this is an episode of Last Week Tonight that explained how most Americans misunderstand how filibustering works, specifically because Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We'll talk about the films today in chronological order. They are The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1945, Kind Hearts and Coronets from 1949, and Robert Wise's The Haunting from 1963. My sneaky agenda is to get you to watch them, because if you have even the slightest interest in the Haunted Mansion, and I know you do because you're here, I think you're gonna love these movies, especially if you're a grown-up goth kid like me. But first, a word about Gothic horror. Gothic horror is generally understood as a subgenre of horror that involves death, romance, or both. Regarding the house, characters must often find secret passageways and secret doors in order to even have an adventure. This is a conceit we see in modern cult classics like Clue. Now, a house in a Gothic story needs to be big enough to contain those secret doors and secret passageways. And in order to be that big, it had to be built and maintained by rich people. This is why you'll also find a lot of inheritance or marrying in plot lines in these stories, because they also needed to figure out a way to bring someone into the adventure who didn't know any of the secrets of the house. Most film fans agree that Guillermo del Toro is the modern master of Gothic horror, so you can also find these ideas in most of his movies. They're even in films like the refreshingly original Ready or Not, which I'll be discussing more in depth in an upcoming essay titled 3 Bloody Brides of Film and What They Represent. The Haunted Mansion, in all of its incarnations, is the prime example of the Gothic horror house. But let's get to the movies. I hope this goes without saying, but spoiler alerts for all of them. Dorian is a beautiful and hedonistic young man who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for eternal youth. An oil painting of him ages in lieu of his body, and not only does it age, it kind of records his sins. At the end of the story, Dorian finally looks at his portrait, and it ain't pretty. I feel like you should see it too. Scary imagery alert in 3, 2, 1. The story may have been controversial in its time, but it certainly made a lasting impact on pop culture. For example, you may know Dorian Gray as one of the members of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. The concept of our true selves being identifiable via magic painting made it to the changing portraits of the Haunted Mansion. As the lightning flashes on the portrait, you see beyond the surface, what's underlying each story. Let's go through a few examples. The aging man, Miss April December, and a Medusa. There's even a painting of the famed ship the Flying Dutchman. As lightning strikes, you can actually see that its sails are in tatters and there's a stormy sea. And if you listen very closely, off in the distance you'll hear, "You're good. You're good. You're good." That was a SpongeBob joke. I'm 37. The first and most important fact about this movie is that Sir Alec Guinness plays 8 different roles to great comedic effect. Ealing Studios is responsible for this film, which purports to be the oldest studio in the world. They had a history of producing funny, high-quality dark comedies like The Ladykillers. Kind Hearts and Coronets is based on a book titled Rank, the Autobiography of a Criminal. Rank. IMDb.com sums up the plot perfectly. A distant poor relative of the Duke of Gascoigne plots to inherit the title by murdering the 8 other heirs who stand ahead of him in the line of succession. Imagine if Downton Abbey and Clue had a baby, but there was less slapstick. I mean, there's no slapstick in Downton Abbey, but you know what I'm saying. Kind Hearts and Coronets is so prestigious and respected, it's actually landed a spot in the Criterion Collection. The movie is dry and sardonic, and even though most of the deaths happen off-screen, visually they're still very, very funny. The one that feels most visually connected to the Haunted Mansion are the couple he sends over a waterfall in a rowboat. He also uses a blowgun to pop the air balloon of a suffragette. Funniest of all, he replaces a photographer's darkroom chemicals with explosives. As our lead is sitting on the lawn with the victim's wife, we hear a faint explosion sound in the distance, and in the reverse shot, we watch the smoke start to rise behind her, all as he attempts to keep a straight face. I'm starting to remember that one time in college, I was a film studies major, because of course I was. Don't do it, kids. You'll be broke forever. I remember recommending to my good movie friend, Joe Moody, the movie Drop Dead Gorgeous. And I was like, it's so amazing, you're gonna love it so much. And I remember him giving it back to me and being like, it's very dark. And as I'm talking about all these deaths that happen on screen, I'm like, it's great, you're gonna love it. I'm realizing something is wrong with me. This goofy, wily coyote tone is very similar to the Haunted Mansion. It reminds me of the comedic tombstones outside, where deaths are turned into funny, rhyming epitaphs. Many people will tell you that dark comedy can feel like a real relief. If you're the type of person who spends a lot of time thinking about death, I spend hours, I spend days. This movie can feel like a real catharsis. On top of all that, Kind Hearts and Coronets has quite a bit to say about classism. One thing I've always loved about the Haunted Mansion is the idea that even being remarkably wealthy can't protect you from death. We also need to talk about the narrator of this movie, the main character. His constant voiceover is really the spine of the entire film. You'll also find an almost omniscient narrator in the Haunted Mansion itself, and that same conceit shows up in the next film on our list. In summation, Kind Hearts and Coronets has Victorian dark humor, funny death scenes, and a similar time period, and I really think it heavily influenced the Haunted Mansion. The facade for the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland was finished in 1963, the same year that The Haunting was released. Even though the ride didn't open until 1969, the movie has this famous stretching door effect that also appears on the ride. Another thing about this movie is that people felt deeply uncomfortable while watching it. Now, with the benefit of decades of film analysis, we know that's because Robert Wise used two techniques: framing that left a lot of negative space, and faces. This movie has eerie faces everywhere, namely as statues. These two combined choices really set audiences on edge, especially back then because people were generally less savvy about how movies were made. In the case of negative space, the brain expects for something to come along and fill it. In other words, when you watch the movie, your subconscious is always nervous. As for the statues, not only do they make us as an audience feel watched, they were always overlooking the characters, which makes us nervous for them. The busts who seem to stare at us in the Haunted Mansion have become part of our awareness now, and knowing how the effect there works is kind of like being an insider, sort of the way superfans can recite the ghost host spiel in the stretching room. But while we're on the subject, could you maybe not? I know that it's like really fun and exciting, and I know all the words too, and it's hard for me to control myself. For a lot of people, that's their first time there. For a lot of other people, it may be their only time there, so just like, don't ruin it. Now, I know we haven't had much time to get into the details of the plot or characters, but again, in this movie, you'll find an omniscient narrator in the form of Dr. Markway. Then something unique happens. By the end of the movie, the narrator has changed. It's now the character of Eleanor, a meek woman who has essentially been absorbed by the haunted house. And that idea might be the most influential of all, that the house in The Haunting and the Haunted Mansion wants you to stay forever, that you transform from a kind of terrified onlooker to a welcome participant. You're one of the gang. You belong. And that's what I think so many people love about the Haunted Mansion. It takes something really scary, death, an end, and turns it into a beginning. One final note about the Haunted Mansion and film culture. The two really are inextricably linked. How? Well, the ride vehicles were designed to control the narrative. A doom buggy creates a frame around you, blacking out anything the ride designers didn't want you to see or focus on. The shape of the vehicle was also used for reveals. For example, the kind of visual wipe that happens when we turn to see the hitchhiking ghosts for the first time. So they aren't just ride vehicles, they're cameras. If you like the Haunted Mansions of Disney, I'd like to recommend Charlie Chaplin's very dark Monsieur Verdoux, or pretty much any book by Edward Gorey. If you're a child of the 80s, you may be interested in the Bette Davis movie The Watcher in the Woods. There are also several stories from Rod Serling's Night Gallery that have to do with being drawn to a mysterious house. And of course, there's the excellent X-Files episode, The Ghosts Who Stole Christmas, which in many ways feels like Haunted Mansion fanfiction. Regarding the mansion itself, several others have done a far better job detailing the extensive history of the ride. You'll find some very high-quality YouTube videos linked in the description below. There is also the fantastic doombuggies.com. Thank you so much for watching the very nerdy, very geeky ramblings of an obsessed fan. Please like, share, subscribe, vote for me for Homecoming Queen, tell me I'm good and smart and pretty.
Thank you for watching, and thank you to our sponsors and Patreon producers for making this video possible. Hit the subscribe button so the creepy fun never has to end. This is Hannah reminding you to keep it creepy.